If Bryan Kohberger really is the killer, why? Why did he do it? Right now, it appears there is only one person in the world who knows the answer.
Are they the musings of somebody trying to impress people online? Are they deep truths about somebody who's agonizing with their own self? We don't know. But the more that you can develop around this person, the better.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It's taken a while for the mainstream media to pick up on Bryan's Tapper Talk posts, but although Newsweek and News Nation have both discussed it, predictably but disappointingly, they both sensationalized the idea by relating it to demons, at least within their respective headline coverage. Now, in this episode, I want to take the psychological analysis we started on neurosis to the next level.
Are you sure you want to hear this?
But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you very much to the hundreds, thousands of you who have subscribed. If you're interested in the discussions going on at Patreon, you can join Patreon at patreon.com/TCRS for as little as $2 a month. So check it out. If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I've subdivided the analysis here into cause, effect, the link between anxiety and visual snow, and then also Becker on schizophrenia. So how do you think we're going to get to that point? So let's start at the beginning, cause. In terms of that, we really want to ask two questions right now. The one is, what was causing Bryan's VS? Simple question. And the second one is, are we dealing with something worse than just ordinary neurosis? Is this just a neurotic person, or is it something worse than that? In addition, I want to ask what seems like a particularly benign meat and potatoes question. Is the root cause of Bryan's mental malaise, because it is by definition mental, is it simple garden variety anxiety? Now, to address that question, let's have a look at his post from July 21st, 2011. He says, sometimes when we move from a sitting position to a standing one, our VS turns really bright and intense in comparison to the usual. Today I got up and it got so bad that I almost fell and my heart pounded intensely. I couldn't see for 8 seconds completely. So what we have here is a 17-year-old, 16 or 17, who simply got up out of his chair, and he was so terrified by that motion or the aftermath of it, but essentially by his own heart palpitations, that he went completely blind for 8 seconds. Is there some disorder we can use to slap a label on this? In another post, he puts the question in all caps, major question. He says, can migraine auras cause this? I know that the visual sensitivity to light had to do with it, but after the migraine meds, is it possible this will disappear after a while? I am 15 in 21 days, right? So he was actually 14 years old at the time, and don't want to wish I'm dead because of this horrible thing. Just look at those words. I don't want to wish I'm dead. And then he says, other questions. Do you ever feel like you can't see something though you can? Do you think the stuff I'm talking about with not being able to see well in the dark has to do with my eyes retaining light? Do you think that I can't see faces clearly because there is too much glare from the light sensitivity? Any recommended diets? Can someone with severe VS like me please tell me how I can succeed in life with this? Do you feel depersonalized? Do you see a fingerprint in your closed eye vision? Bryan, for all his intelligence, suspects his eyes may be retaining light. And he also complains about seeing a fingerprint in his closed eye vision. Do we need some elaborate medical diagnosis for this? On November 7th, 2009, he writes, it seems to be in my left eye peripheral, flickering like when you look at the sky, but it is ignorable. I thought I was losing the vision, but nah, it's just the flickering. LOL. So on November 7th, 2009, when Bryan was around 14 or 15 years old, He thought he was going blind, but then realized, nah, it's just the flickering. It's easy to imagine connecting these symptoms Bryan apparently had to some sort of underlying madness or at least a maddening condition that carried over through an entire decade into his final fateful semester at Washington State University. But let's be clear, did Bryan really suffer from VS right through college and into his PhD? For example, while he was either grading his students or giving a lecture in front of 150 students? I doubt it. So what happened to his VS? What changed? Did he take the right medication? Did he see the right doctor? On September 23rd, 2010, he wrote, I can't remember anything recent or anything from childhood. I used to be able to remember everything from my childhood and everything every day for a month before me. Now I am just a blank soul living in the now. What hurts the most is knowing that every time I try to remember things from the past, I can't. And my mind is so hung up with VS, all the migraine VS effects mentally, the buzzing in my ear, so there's even tinnitus there, that I can't even focus on that. I got it September 21st of last year, and ever since then, I have been depressed. I can't remember anything at all, and I always have this horrible pressure in my head. My mind is never not on visual snow, and I always wonder what a normal person would be doing while I sit there and suffer. The whole thing has made me crazy. I feel like my life is pointless because people can think about times with parents and childhood and be happy, and I won't be able to. Now, it has to be said, anyone with extreme levels of anxiety or even just stress will struggle with their memory and will struggle to concentrate. So consider that. I mean, if he's unable to remember anything, how was he able to graduate high school, let alone impress the socks off his lecturers at DeSales? And remember, even during high school, they said that he was getting good grades. So obviously he was able to remember things. Obviously, there is a bit of exaggeration going on here. Well, how could he remember? Well, I will argue that the thing that changed was that college in Pennsylvania was less of a trial by fire than high school, than the girls throwing things at him and chasing him away. Also, Bryan's ability to deal with anxiety likely improved over time, and his posts on Tapa Talk actually demonstrate his fluctuating and I guess broadly improving ability to manage, aka understand, what was going on with himself vis-a-vis his condition. On January 15, 2011, he writes, quote, I have had VS since September 21st of 2009. Since then I have changed, mainly from the anxiety and sense of derealization and hopelessness. Today I felt a deep heartbeat in my head, one that felt through my eyes and all over my head. I get this a lot but never think about it. At times when I lay down and then get up for something, I get this feeling in my head that is weird, and then I see the bright white version of VS. I also feel the beat. My theory is that VS seems to be migraine related, but in reality, it is just a weird thing that occurs for some people where the arteries and blood vessels in one's head are inflamed for a large amount of time. I'm sure no MRI would pick up slight inflammation from the veins, arteries that pump through our heads. I always have this weird feeling in my head, and to me, it feels like something inflamed in my head. We need to try to figure out a way to stop the inflammation. I think that anxiety causes VS. Why do you think migraine pills don't work for VS? Obviously because we don't have inflamed parts of our brain. We have inflamed blood vessels and veins, well, whatever you want to call them. So have a look at those words. Since then I have changed, mainly from the anxiety. Also, I think anxiety causes VS. And then he reiterates the same sentiment shortly afterwards in an entirely separate post. He writes, I believe it was the anxiety that caused this for you. Same thing happened to me. Quite a difference here from January 15th, 2011 to a year earlier, around about November 7th, 2009, when he thought he was going blind. There's no doubt that the high school phase of life is one of the first, and for some people, the worst brushes we get with stress and anxiety. Our bodies change. We're overwhelmed by floods of well, yes, overwhelming emotions and hormones. And within this maelstrom, we also have to navigate peer networks designed to gauge, examine, evaluate, and set our status for the foreseeable future. And while all of this is happening, with these emotional floods, we've got to try and find a way to manage those emotions, but they're hitting us for the very first time. And obviously, if you're being bullied and mocked and ridiculed, and then your deal is at an order of magnitude different to other people. You've got more anxiety to deal with in terms of the total. And so some enter and exit these teenage trials with flying colors. Others, like Bryan, fail miserably. If there is a failure to launch during high school, the next platform is college. Didn't Bryan fail to launch himself on that platform as well? And that then brings us to effect. So it's clear that anxiety was the root cause gnawing at Bryan. But this in turn, and someone actually said, the fact that they could remember 10 years later exactly how Bryan was sort of tortured at high school. Friends could remember what was said to him, and that it was quite big. The way that he was bullied was quite serious. Means that it had to have been serious. Some people can't even remember kids at high school, let alone remember what was said to them 10 years later. So if anxiety was the root cause gnawing at Bryan, well, this in turn raises a rather disconcerting question of its own. Why was an ostensibly smart kid like Bryan so ill-equipped to self-soothe? Why was he turning to strangers on a forum instead of to his own parents, whom he admits he wasn't treating very well? Self-soothing in the classic sense can be anything from thumb-sucking and fingernail biting to masturbation and drug abuse. It can also include self-harm such as cutting, biting the ends of pencils or pens, or hypochondria. By giving a name to a real or imagined affliction, there is a sense that the sufferer has some sort of handle, some control over it. But do you see how all of these basically innate self-soothing techniques sort of involve a transfer of the inner malaise, the inner gnawing, to a gnawing of something on the outside? In other words, the chewing inside the mind is converted, translated, transferred to an external object. Fingernails, pencils. Instead of thoughts chewing on the mind, the thoughts lead to actual chewing on something outside. Fingernails, pencils, perhaps masturbation to pornography. But consider the potential psychological link between this simple setup, failure or difficulty to self-soothe, right? And one of the symptoms that is part of this, which is self-harm, for example, cutting. Compare all of that to possibly the suspect years later who is having difficulty self-soothing once again, but now is actively stalking, actively feeding and fueling his anxiety with obsessive-compulsive coveting. And how does he figure his way through that psychological quagmire? Isn't it by cutting? But this time it's not him, it's them. So we now go to the link between anxiety and visual snow. Do you think there is a link? Do you think the link is just part of the process, or do you think it's explicit? Well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist or even a psychologist to accurately answer whether there's a link between anxiety and visual snow. You simply have to perform a statistical analysis. What do the stats say? And several recent peer-reviewed studies, one as recently as last year or 2 years ago, have done so, and they found a clear correlation. 45%, almost half of all VS cases, also suffered from severe anxiety. Also, the worse the anxiety, the worse the VS. In fact, the correlation is so explicit, VS is sometimes called visual snow anxiety. It's also interesting that when I first discussed VS, I compared it to my own experience with tinnitus. Well, it appears to be so similar that we see comparisons elsewhere in the literature surrounding this topic as well. But clearly, Bryan isn't simply just suffering from anxiety. He has OCD. He self-soothed for years using heroin, and he's also a hypochondriac. He worries excessively about his health, and he's carried his health anxiety into his vegan approach. And so we are faced with an interesting question, psychologically speaking. If the suspect's anxiety was so extreme to bring on VS, and if we accept that we are dealing with not just a garden variety of anxiety, but a Hawaiian tropic level neurotic individual, an extremely neurotic person, then where does that take us next? In his own words, Bryan describes feeling stuck in the depths of his own mind, and his affliction is so serious he alludes to feeling depressed, perhaps even suicidal. He says, quote, "I am stuck in the depths of my mind where I have to constantly battle my demons. Am I here or am I fake? Now I look in the mirror and I see this sickly, tired, useless, and stupid man in the mirror. He's a complete disgrace. He doesn't even desire to live." Well, if it's so extreme, and if we are dealing with an individual so wrapped up in his symbolic psychology, which is necessarily fictitious and private, then we may be dealing with someone who is struggling to interpret reality properly. Let me say that again. We may be dealing, kind of in a general sense, with someone who is actually struggling to interpret reality properly. I mean, isn't that what the VS is hinting at anyway? So, could we be dealing with schizophrenia? What is schizophrenia? It's a serious mental disorder, right? Serious mental disorder in which people interpret reality abnormally. It may include hallucinations, delusions, extremely disordered thinking, as well as behavior that impairs daily functioning. And it can be disabling. So the calculus works like this. Anxiety leads to neurosis. Neurosis leads to schizophrenia. And again, we're not talking about ordinary anxiety. We're not talking about ordinary neurosis. This is an extreme level. It may be that the heroin episode that lasted 4 years did nothing to repair Bryan's disordered thinking or improve his poor decision-making. It may, in fact, have made it worse. He may have just repressed all of that instability in the sense of putting him into a stupor or a fog. Well, as a result, has he ever really learned to deal with emotions in the present, let alone heal from past trauma? And that then brings us to Ernest Becker. What does he say about schizophrenia? The main characteristic of schizophrenia is an underlying state of terror. This is terror of the world, fear of social interactions and rejection. Does that say anything potentially about the individual we're dealing with here? In the Tupper Talk forum, do we have a sense of an individual treating his own body like some sort of utterly untrustworthy and alien animal body? Because that is what Becker refers to. He says, the fact that human experience is split into two modes in the experience of the schizophrenic, the symbolic self and the physical body, and that these two modes of experience can be quite distinct. In some people, they are so distinct as to be unintegrated, and these are the people we call schizophrenic. The hypersensitive individual reacts to his body as something strange to himself, something utterly untrustworthy, something not under his control. Right away, we can see that the schizophrenic is burdened, like all of us, with an alien animal body. That's quoting from Becker. So how does he deal with this terror? Well, he tries to intellectualize it. Becker describes this so eloquently as the hypermagnification of mental processes to secure his death. That is terror, not actual death. His death transcendence, his transcendence of terror. In other words, he tries to think his way out of it. And so Becker reinforces this whole line of inquiry by saying he has to try to be a hero almost entirely ideationally from within a bad body seating and in a very personal way, hence the contrived nature of his efforts. No one understood better than Chesterton how freakish men become when they must rely on thoughts alone, separate from generous emotions in an expansive and secure body. And so isn't that what makes this person weird and creepy and strange, is that he is operating from an entirely sort of mental place. He's not a integrated person with thoughts and body and dynamics that connect him to himself and to others. He's kind of just a walking thinking machine. Now, I have referred to this as a psychological crime, one based on symbolic reality more than actuality. And here we have the strings connecting to that psychology, ideation. This is an individual entirely devoted to ideas, concepts, thoughts. Isn't that, in a certain sense, what criminology is? Let's think about what the criminal is thinking. Let's think about thinking. Let's think endlessly and congratulate ourselves on being such incredible thinkers. But a person who is entirely in his head is a schizophrenic. The world, the body, life, all of that is death. All that remains then, all that's safe to engage with, is the distant residue of life, which is thoughts about life, thoughts about other people that are engaged in life. What are they doing? What are they thinking? So what is the solution to this problem? And this is where it has potentially a bearing on you and me and on society. If this is the problem, and let's face it, we are barely 2 months into the aftermath of the murders, but if it is the problem, what, pray tell, is the solution? Ernest Becker writes that the defeat of despair is not mainly an intellectual problem for an active organism, but a problem of self-stimulation via movement. What he's really talking about there is, if you have despair, if you may be not happy about injustice in the world, and you're despairing perhaps about other things, how do you actually deal with that? Well, he says despair cannot be authentically dealt with as merely as an intellectual problem. One cannot simply diagnose the malaise and expect that one now has mastered it, let alone overcome it. So here it is. Becker writes, quote, "Beyond a given point, man is not helped by more knowing. He can only redeem himself and his situation by living and doing in a partly self-forgetful way," end quote. In other words, have some fun. Don't be so serious about absolutely everything. Don't try and think your way out of a paper bag. Do a little bit of what you see the kids doing there in the fun house. Anyway, Becker continues. He says, quote, "We must plunge into experience and then reflect on the meaning of it all. All reflection and no plunging drives us mad. All plunging and no reflection, and we are brutes." And so what do you think Bryan was doing? Wasn't Bryan, in terms of his PhD and all of the studies, all reflection and no plunging, all thinking and no living? So there is a sense in that the suspect here understood that he needed to move away. He himself understood this, that he needed to move away from the academic study of criminology and move beyond that in some way as a person and move into some sort of direct experience of life. But if he was caught up enough in this whole process, he may not have thought about it as moving into a direct experience of life, but of death. After all, he's studying criminology. He wants to get as close as he can to that. Well, what is closer than actually committing a crime? Clearly, a rational person would decide to do this whole idea of moving into direct experience. They would do that in a traditional, rational way. They would go to a party. They would get a job or something. And we do know that Bryan did apply for one. But an irrational, unstable person struggling with his own reality might exchange the notion of studying a particular concept to becoming that concept as the highest expression of what he was doing. In other words, manifesting himself as the thought that he's endlessly thinking. So have a look at the 3 other pairs of eyeballs in this image. Compare them to the 2 egg whites in Bryan's face. Once upon a time, the attraction Bryan had to heroin was to its calming impact. The real question is whether his drug use led to the VS or the VS to the drug use, but either way, using drugs to manage anxiety is maladaptive. Take the drugs away and one still has to face or learn to face the withering winds of reality head on, naked, unassisted, stripped bare, all over again. So if we try to intuit his psychology, and as I say, this is very early in our knowledge of this person to be saying this, but one has a sense that he has spent a lot of time simply thinking about thinking. And as a result, when Bryan emerges as a new man in college, certainly in terms of the PhD aspect, he looks the part to some extent of a new man, but he still doesn't know how to approach people or talk to people or soothe himself in a positive way, even as a 28-year-old. And I dealt with that in the previous episode. So what is happening is he's so lonely, his being is aching for some relief from the constant gnawing, the constant thinking. He would love to have conversations with someone else, but he ends up chatting their ears off, like chewing their ears off, and people don't want to talk to him. His life force is yearning to plunge into existence, but like taking heroin, instead of self-soothing by going for a walk or playing with a pet or signing up to some club or something, or talking about his feelings or exercising, the schizophrenic takes his thinking to an extreme level. He's used to thinking in extremes, and so when he does apply it, it just is completely normal for him to take that to an extreme level. His thought process manifests in the extreme brutality that emerges at 1122 King Road. The scene is a picture in Technicolor, a snapshot really of the interior of the suspect's mind. Messy, scarlet, disorganized, surreal, shocking, unstable, frightening, terrifying, and somehow, despite all the sharp edges, numb and devoid of life. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.